It's good to be with you this morning on this wonderful fall Arkansas morning. Tim Murphy and I have known each other for quite a few years now. Most of the conversations we've had through the years were in the house gymnasium. He's a pretty ferocious workout guy in the weight room, and we would always talk generally about two topics. Number one is, it is not a coincidence, he is indeed related to the Murphy family, and cousin Chip, I think, is going to be seeing you later on today, and in fact, they just both bored me all to hell talking about their ancestors and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and some guys were drilling for oil in Pennsylvania at the same time they were drilling for oil in Arkansas, apparently in the blood, but that's a lot of his interest. Of course, he just assumed I'd love talking about that stuff. And then the second thing is, Tim has had this intense interest in our veterans and what's happening in our war zones, the combination of PTSD and traumatic brain injury, and he is, as a psychologist, he's put his money where his mouth is, and a couple years ago joined the Navy, and now spends a weekend a month at Bethesda working with our veterans. So it's great to have you here in Arkansas, Tim. Please give Tim a good welcome.
Well, good morning. I'm going to spare you the genealogy maps and all of those, but it's great to be back in Arkansas. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for the invitation to join you. Vic and I have talked for a long time about coming down here to this prestigious place, and it's a delight to be here. So from my background as a psychologist, how did I get to a point where I'm going to be talking about America's energy? Well, much of that comes from my district in Pennsylvania, Southwest Pennsylvania being one that is loaded with Marcellus shale natural gas. And actually, when you look at Pennsylvania, when I go to Houston and talk to oil executives down there, I remind them that we taught them how to drill. It's not the other way around. And that many of them remind me that they went to Penn State's Petroleum Engineering Department, and they show me their allegiances to the Nittany Lion. But that being the case, Pittsburgh is also an area, of course, rich in a steel heritage, but long history of oil, natural gas, and massive amounts of coal, which we could use to take care of America's energy needs for 2.5 centuries at least, and enough natural gas to replace much of what Saudi Arabia is and what we buy from them. The issue is we got to drill it, we've got to transport it safely, and in our Natural Gas Caucus, our mission is one of responsible exploration, safe transmission, and expanded use of natural gas, and being part of a menu of a wide range of energy portfolio that we can use to move America towards energy independence. But let me explain a couple reasons why this is important and what I think we can do. The debt of this country right now is $14.5 trillion and growing. It's about 98% of the value of our economy. We are approaching that tipping point that Greece has found itself at, and Ireland and Portugal and Italy and so many other nations in the EU and around the world whose debt to GDP ratio has hit that dangerous level. The amount that each one of us in this room owes is $45,000. That's how much we each owe on the national debt, and growing at $58,000 a second. We also have nearly 10 million Americans out of work. We have another 14 million Americans plus looking for work or have accepted some other job, but still report themselves as underemployed. And it's been at this problematic rate for the last 29 months. So we know that's a serious problem. We also know over the last decade we've lost about 5 million manufacturing jobs, many of those going to other nations around the world, in part because they're competing, but in part because our costs, our policies, our regulatory structure here is oftentimes much more difficult than if a country says goes to India or China and finds that there are basically no controls there that deal with emissions or pollution, et cetera, and also cheap labor and a wide range of other things in addition to them manipulating their currency and dumping, et cetera. So we're behind the 8 ball in terms of fighting back on that. But also noting that our nation and our world has the world has energy needs which are increasing massively. I mean, by the year 2035, some predict that the global energy needs will increase by about 53% plus. I'm not clear beyond that, but it's pretty clear that we're going to have huge demands grow here, and those may even be greater than that. Instead of 53%, may be even going much more, depending upon how we use things. And we also know total consumption of liquid fuels in this country is growing. I know that there's groups out there that say we got to stop using fossil fuels, stop using oil. But the fact is we're going to need it. We're going to continue to need it, not only for transportation, but also for the chemical industry and a wide range of other uses too. And just to say we're going to stop using it is not realistic, it is not practical, and it chokes off a source of revenue for this nation. Now, right now, when you look at what it costs to develop other kinds of energy that we deal with, solar, about 20 to 40 cents per kilowatt, nuclear, a little under 4 cents per kilowatt, coal, about 1.8 cents per kilowatt, wind, 10 cents, natural gas, 4.3 cents, oil, 16 cents. And so we see that there is a wide range of costs here. We know that coal and natural gas are something that we can use as a less expensive approach to dealing with energy. But it comes down to these points that people oftentimes talk about, well, what about emissions? What about pollution? What about global warming? What about air? This may not be the venue to talk about all the details about issues of global warming, but put it down in this. When we talk about the issues where Congress disagrees, where America disagrees, and knowing that a lot of scientists are challenging each other now on just what is the human contribution to global warming, are we really in a global warming period? And maybe it's a psychologist to me that says, where can we agree? We ought to at least agree on this. We don't like dirty air, dirty water, and dirty soil, and we ought to agree at least, let's clean them all up. And whatever we do, work towards as responsible stewards of the environment, towards clean air, land, and water when we are producing energy. And let's also conserve and not waste what we develop, and whatever we do develop, handle it in a responsible way. Well, knowing where we stand with our energy demands and knowing where we stand with unemployment, while there continues to be stimulus bills or son of stimulus offered in Washington, D.C., I say we don't have to go that way. And that is, we don't need to go down a road of saying, let's offer some temporary jobs through permanent tax increases, especially when we are in extended recession. Rather than continue to hammer on that same nail, perhaps we ought to be looking at a different route. Now look at a couple things of where we get our energy from now. We now import about 65% of our oil, and much of that is from hostile regimes. I mean, look at the OPEC nations where we get our oil from now. Look at the activity of Venezuela, not only internally what they do, their relationship with Iran, their intimidation activities with Colombia. Look at Iran, although we supposedly don't buy oil directly from Iran, certainly they benefit from OPEC pricing. And we know they use their revenues to develop nuclear weapons and missiles, to fund proxy armies with Hezbollah and Hamas, and do this in areas of Lebanon and Syria. And look at the developments that take place in so many in the areas in the Mideast, funded to a large extent by OPEC oil money coming through, even directly to help terrorists by building IEDs and bombs and funding the Al-Qaeda and Taliban activity. It should leave us all with that unsettling realization that when you put that nozzle in the tank of your car to realize you're funding both sides in the war on terror. And beyond all these economic issues, when I do go and I work with our wounded warriors at the hospital, and I see their missing arms and legs and eyes and faces and half their heads, I say that's reason enough to say if we can move towards energy independence and stop buying oil from countries who are threats to us, that's reason enough to move forward. But what can we do? Well, we know that on land we have a lot of natural gas resources. I mentioned the Marcellus Shale. We also know there's a lot of oil resources. Not only long-term discoveries from places like here in Arkansas and Texas and Oklahoma, but also up in the Dakotas and other areas there too, where we're realizing not only is there a lot of oil, but using new drilling techniques, there's a lot more that can be obtained at deeper wells and from shale areas with natural gas. It's exciting. It's an exciting opportunity. But we also have massive amounts of oil off our coast and natural gas as well. So while policies have come through our Energy Commerce Committee and have been pushed forward on dealing with such things as climate change, we have to understand that if we continue the policies that are being pushed, it will cost families a lot more to heat their homes, to cool their homes, to have their electricity on each year at a time when families are also feeling that they are squeezed with their resources. So while demand for energy is growing and while we are looking at prices going up, what comes from our resources off our outer continental shelf? Well, it is quite possible that if we were to go through with what is out off our outer continental shelf, the Department of Interior estimates we have between 86 billion and 115 billion barrels of oil on our OCS. Now, I have to give you a caveat on that, because much of that is based upon surveys done in the 1970s. And I think you'd agree with me, if you don't, even if you don't know anything about the oil industry, we've probably improved a little bit in our techniques of surveillance and engineering since the 1970s. Look at even Brazil, that is discovering new oil things, and some huge announcement the other day about new oil fields that they have found there. Well, we have a lot of undiscovered oil, and oftentimes when the Minerals Management Service has an analysis here, they may be off by sometimes a factor of 5. It may be that much more oil is there. But let's use their numbers and look what that would mean. Basically, what it comes down to is the new federal revenue, if we open up the OCS, Atlantic, the Gulf, and Pacific. And I'm not talking about even here the areas up in Alaska yet, but just the OCS areas. It's estimated that new federal revenues would be between $2.2 and $3.7 trillion for the next 20 years. Even to the federal government, that's a lot of money. Now compare where this comes out. This is not only output. I mean, the output, overall economic output, is estimated to be about $8 trillion over 20 years. Employment would be about 1 million jobs per year. Wages would come in about $70 billion. Federal tax revenue, just the income tax, about $54 billion a year. State and local taxes, another $19 billion a year. This is based upon the low numbers. So we're using our most conservative estimates. And then there's the royalties from leasing and from the oil royalties and the leasing agreements. There's a lot of money out there. So while this nation, while Washington, D.C. is locked in this disputes, do we cut, do we cap, do we balance, do we tax? My question is, why aren't we reaching out and doing something more where we know it's there? It's along these lines. I should find out, does Arkansas have a lottery? Do you have a? Yes. Okay, I thought so. I just wanted to be sure. If I knew it, if I could tell you what the lottery numbers were, would you go out and play it tonight? I think you would. Of course, you might not get to keep it because someone would wonder if the game was stacked. We had that problem in Pennsylvania once. But nonetheless, if something's a pretty sure bet, you might just bet on it. Well, here, it's not even a gamble. We know there's something out there. The question is, why aren't we doing this? Well, when we talk about instead having a tax raised on oil as the President's proposed, over 10 years it would yield about $40 billion. 10 years, $40 billion. Just so you could put that in perspective, that $40 billion would be about enough to run the government for about 6 hours. It's not really going to go very far, but it does have some emotional appeal when you see people railing that, well, you know, I'm out of a job, but Exxon's making profits. And so it has some emotional appeal. We could actually get, just from some lease sales, several times that amount per year if we opened up some of these areas for drilling. The income tax I mentioned before too, but where would we go with all of this? What will we do with this money? Well, let's talk about America's needs. I'm not a believer that we say, well, let's just put everybody on the federal employment. You know, that's not going to work. I think instead, how do we use this to do the things that people expect their government to do and help grow the private sector jobs? Well, let's look at one area where I think we all agree that it is government's role, and that has to do with our infrastructure. The American Association of Civil Engineers had estimated that the needs in our nation, in our roads, our highways, our bridges, our locks, our dams, water, sewer projects, airports, is about $2.7 trillion. There's about $930 billion needed to upgrade our roads and bridges, $87 billion needed for aviation, $12.5 billion for dams and locks. The drinking water and wastewater issues are so huge that we actually just leak into the ground millions of gallons of water every week here, and that is about a $250 billion problem to solve that in America. We also have a lot of problems with our energy infrastructure, antiquated power plants, antiquated grid that wastes a lot of power between the plant and your home, never gets anywhere. We also have a long list, a litany of problems with waterways that have had a legacy of pollution in them. Our rivers, our streams. The Great Lakes alone is a $30 billion problem in America. Add to it everything from the Everglades to the Mississippi Delta to the Chesapeake Bay to San Francisco Bay. All these areas, a long legacy of pollution, but no money to clean it up. I've introduced a bill, H.R. 1861, and it's a bipartisan bill, and it's one that would actually dedicate money towards this from the revenues from the oil and the natural gas off our coast and dedicate it to rebuild America. And what I believe is actually taking on the new American dream. That if we do what government should be doing, that we expect government to work on our infrastructure and use our revenues to do that, and if we recognize, instead of saying that there's a shrinking pool of revenue because we have a shrinking job base here, perhaps we should look at new resources, and we recognize those resources there. Why not use ours instead of OPEC's? Why not build our revenues instead of squeezing more out of those that remain? And why not look upon this as a huge positive opportunity for America, instead of fomenting the kind of anger and rage that I think so much of that comes out of Washington by trying to pick winners and losers and attack one group and set them against each other. That doesn't work. The politics of this in Washington right now, and I go back to my years as working as a psychologist, and very often I would be dealing with a child custody case. And so I would be talking to the mother and the father separately because they wouldn't dare be in the same room or the same building at the same time. And one of the things I always caution them is I said, whatever your differences are with your ex, please do not tell your child to hate the other parent. Because as soon as you tell your child and you give your child permission to hate a parent, you're next. You're next. And it's going to happen. And what's happened in America is we have done that same thing. By setting liberals against conservatives, Democrats against Republicans, the haves with the have-nots, Main Street with Wall Street. Probably the most common bond we have in America right now is people looking for someone to blame and not looking for a way of saying, how can I take responsibility and move my life forward? I say enough of that when we have an opportunity like this to bring America together. So 1861, the Infrastructure, Jobs, and Energy Independence Act, opens the door to safe and responsible exploration. Now, I trust our drilling rigs a lot more than I do in other countries. I've been to other countries and I've seen some of their well sites. And I know that whether they're loading them on ships in their harbors or on the sites themselves, I trust a lot more what can happen. Plus, we don't have terrorists threatening to blow up our pipelines here like they do over there, and using that for political pressure. Or using, for example, what Russia did with Ukraine to bring them to their knees and shutting off natural gas. We don't have to be brought to our knees again. We don't have to be dealing with countries that say, if you don't do our bidding, we will cut off your oil and natural gas. I'd much rather say, keep it, we will work on ours and use it to help our people. But with all of this money, well, let me tell you what goes in this bill. Knowing that we have this $8 trillion worth of economic output, and I mentioned about the trillions that go through there, we divide up this way. We would take about 20% over this 20 years for the infrastructure renewal to fix our roads and highways and bridges, about 15% for renewable energy. Recognize we do need to develop other energy sources, but it is expensive. And we also recognize some parts of the country are not very good for solar and some parts are great. Some parts aren't so good for wind and other parts are. And we have to remember that those windmills are pretty big structures and they take up a lot of space. And you can't run them all over urban areas. And some places, if you run them out too far in the rural, by the time the power gets to the places where it's needed, you've lost a lot in the meantime. But we also know that energy efficiency in buildings, in our factories, in our office buildings, in our homes, we oftentimes waste between 20 and 40% of the energy. And although we tell people it's a good idea to have light-sensitive lighting systems and HVAC systems that work to be more adaptive and more modernized, still that takes money. And even if it's something as simple as insulation and windows, et cetera, it takes money. So we actually say this will provide the tax credits, not borrowing money, not going into debt, but using this as tax credits to be a huge incentive all across America to capture that energy lost and keep it there. We also invest in clean coal technology. Of our coal-fired power plants in America, we have a couple of choices here. We continue the attack and say coal is dirty, let's not have it. And some organizations are out there bragging that they have stopped or shut down over 100 coal-fired power plants in America in the last few years. We still need the energy, and we have abundant resources of coal. I say, why not instead to work on changing some of our regulations to encourage plants to clean themselves up. Right now, under new source review, a plant is told if you do anything to produce more coal, your whole plant has to do everything under the EPA Clean Air Act, everything. So if a plant says, well, we wanted to improve our generators, we wanted to change our boilers, make them more efficient so we could actually burn less coal and produce more power, the EPA says, no, you can't. You do everything or you do nothing. Literally, that's how this works. So the plants say, then we'll do nothing. We were going to invest $50 million for plant improvements, but we don't have $800 million to do it all. Then the EPA says, then you're not doing anything. That's the battle we go through. I say let's set incentives up for incremental improvements. When you have 40% of our coal-fired power plants have inadequate or no scrubbers, you don't have to be rocket scientists to know this is not working. And when we're telling students across America, don't use coal, it's bad, I say that's an easy out that's going to choke us in terms of not having enough power and it being very expensive. Why not instead to challenge the next generation? And I oftentimes will do this and hold up a piece of coal and says, what do you see? And they say something's dirty, it's fossil fuels, it's polluting. You could see that. But you could also see opportunity. So right now, if we get out of a lump of coal 35, 38% of the energy, that's a lot of waste. And if it also produces emissions, that's bad. So if we challenge people to say, what if we recognize that the person who ends up getting out of that coal 45, 50, 80, 90% of the energy out of that coal and reducing emissions to near zero, that's Nobel Prize stuff. That makes you trillionaires in this country, in this world. That is massive. And to use our energy and to say, we have this challenge. I think of that scene in that movie Apollo 13. Remember where they couldn't figure out how to, they had the two different systems that would convert CO2 to oxygen. And so while the astronauts are reaching a level of suffocating in their own space capsule, there was a scene where the scientists at NASA brought and they dumped on the table all the things. This is what we have to work with, folks. We have to figure out how to make this fit this. And so they came up with this contraption using duct tape and hoses, et cetera, but they made it work. Now that saved some lives and it was a huge challenge, but we are there with coal too, and so that's why we think it's important to put some money from this into investing into clean coal technology and helping us make that change. We also use money for other types of carbon-free technology such as nuclear, recognize we need to move forward in that, and also some money that goes to producing states. And by the way, we also dedicate 10% of the money to paying down the federal debt, It is a huge investment and the largest investment of our infrastructure in this nation's history. It is the largest investment in actually cleaning up our nation without having to raise taxes, borrow from other countries, or go into more debt. It can be done. And I want to say this about it. Vic, you would have been impressed with this week when we were in session. We have this, at the end of every day's session, there's something called special orders. And members get an hour, usually the Democrats, Republican Democrats, or maybe each side gets 1 hour, but they get to talk about any issue. And sometimes it gets pretty vituperative, but people just getting up there and pounding their fist down and saying that the other side of the aisle is the worst thing that's ever happened to the universe and why they need to be destroyed. And sometimes they even talk a little bit about policy, but it's generally one side talking about the other. We did something I had not seen before, and we actually had about 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans each spoke about this bill and talked about what America ought to be doing to clean itself up and empower itself and rebuild itself. And to have that kind of bipartisan support was something that was not seen before. And I think that's something that America is also crying out for. That although the battles and the nasty dialogue that anybody can produce may make some compelling watching on cable TV, and I know at times when I've been asked on cable TV, they do a little pre-interview, and if they think you're going to be nasty and mean, they say, well, why don't you come on, we want you on, we'll bring you on a regular basis. But there's times if you say, look, I'm really not going to get into this way, I'm not going to attack somebody, then they say, well, we'll call you back. But believe me, there's people out there who want to make America work again. and want to use the way our government was designed to have debate and civil discourse, the way that Madison and Adams and everybody else designed this country. They're sure we ought to be able to get up there and debate and figure out some solutions and work on this. And we may compromise the way, but not the goal. And here I think if our goal is getting America working again and cleaning it up and using our resources, not sending it around the world, we can do that. So this is what I wanted to lay out here, but and I also want to take some questions, I think. We have some time for that. So on this, or perhaps some other issues, if you need some psychological help, I'm still licensed, so I can help with some of those things too. So is there anybody who wants to ask any questions about this or any other congressional issue?
Would raise your hand so we can get the microphone to you. It's an early morning group, so there's a question right here, Bob. He's got it.
Thank you, I'm glad to hear you saying that. I'm glad to hear the message you brought today coming out of Washington, because from out here it appears that, and Kelly's heard me say this before, it appears that Washington's energy playbook is very outdated, very outdated. And it seems like there's not any awareness of what you just described. Now, it sounds like there's some bipartisan support in there, but I mean, where are we in your mind in developing the energy policy that starts taking on our strengths and technology and the existing resources?
Well, I think that what we're going to do with regard to taking on some of these, is I actually think the time is right and the mood is right to make some of these changes now. I don't know if we'll have a global, a wide-ranging energy policy. We should. Right now, our energy policy seems to be one that's unfortunately filled with a lot of scandal about companies like Solyndra and building automobiles in Finland, et cetera, and looking at see if there's someone offering favoritism. We really need a policy that focuses instead on what are we going to need for the next 20 years. Not 90 days shovel ready, not 2-year election cycle, but the next 20 years. And I think that by tying it into some of this transportation and infrastructure needs, we have now a highly motivated Congress who wants to do something, tying that in also with the jobless rate. I know that Speaker John Boehner, for example, said in a speech he gave in September in front of the Economic Club of Washington, D.C., he said, "I'm not opposed to responsible spending to repair and improve infrastructure, but if we want to do it in a way that truly supports long-term economic growth and job creation, let's link the next highway bill to an expansion of American-made energy production. Removing some of the unnecessary government barriers that prevent our country from utilizing its vast energy resources could create millions of new jobs." And there's a natural link between the two, he went on to say. So we know now that the analysis is being done of this bill and other mechanisms to tie in with the highway bill and to tie in with a wider range of infrastructure. And it may be that the super committee, who is desperately trying to find ways of saving money and raising revenue by expanding some of the revenue sources, they're looking at this as well. I suspect in this, some version of this is going to come through for a vote on the floor. I don't know if it'll be this one, but that's the way things work in Washington. You always kind of pick and choose apples from different trees, and then you make applesauce with it. So that's okay. But a wide-ranging policy, I don't know. But at least getting into this and recognizing we can't turn our backs on natural gas and oil, we need to use those, is a big step forward. So I think we're going to go with that.
Yes, sir. Question right there.
Congressman, thank you first for coming. Enjoyed your remarks. As you know, there are vast amounts of Canadian oil in Alberta and the oil sands. And one of the things that I think those of us that are involved in this sort of thing look to is North American independence, not just U.S.
Yes.
One of the things that's a very controversial issue right now is the Keystone XL pipeline to bring Alberta oil to the Gulf Coast refineries. It's a very slow and deliberate and painful process. What do you see happening with that approval or disapproval, if you will?
I know that in our committee and in the House, we've dealt with the issue of the Keystone pipeline. There's strong support for it and bipartisan support. Although the opposition seems to be coming from a couple of sectors. One, the fear that the pipeline would cause environmental harm from pipe ruptures or damaging the land. And another group saying that we would just be selling that to China. Now, along those lines, I think of two things. One, that pipeline can go across and go to our refineries down in the Gulf, or it can go across to Vancouver and be shipped out to China. In fact, if you want to route to China, it's much easier to go to Vancouver and west than it is to go south. But I think some of the positives of moving that forward is just the sheer number of jobs that would come from that. And again, I trust our workers to do that. to recognize we need to build quality pipe and quality welds and be good stewards of the environment as we're doing this, and not just see it as because it's going to make some changes in the land, therefore we shouldn't do it. I'm sure every part in this country has those two concepts they deal with, NIMBY and banana. NIMBY, not in my backyard, and banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And so it is part of that, that approach too. I'd much rather build in a responsible way and set zoning and ordinances, say you have to fix it up, and if you mess it up, the kind of things our mothers taught us years ago, and you got to do it right. So I see Congress moving forward in that, see what the Senate does with that as well, but that's going to be great jobs and a great source of North American oil. Yes.
Laura.
Thank you for being here. My name is Laura Crosby. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. My question is about reducing regulations on solar panels and the ability for states to allow plug-in power programs that allow people to really see the economic benefits of putting solar panels on their house, and how that can be furthered through regulation, deregulation in Congress.
Are you referring to having solar panels plug in and then put energy back onto the grid from that?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that's a great benefit, particularly if people want to make that private investment in their house as well, or in some cases have some tax credits as well and put that back up. And many states have moved forward with that. I think as part of a wide-ranging policy, there is a benefit to that as well. I know when we have dealt with some of the solar power issues of creating incentives for this, it has unfortunately, and again I go back to the cylinder issue, unfortunately has been corrupted by some other issues in terms of who's favoring who in that, and we shouldn't be doing that. If we're going to offer guaranteed loans, or if we're going to offer some sort of a tax credit for doing things, let's make sure it's done in a fair market, science-based area too. So I would like to see us do things like that, recognizing that I don't see us doing that to say, let's do this instead of finding out a way to clean up coal, or instead of other things. Let's do it together. And I like the idea. If someone wants to be in free enterprise and sell, says, you know, I got a sunny house here and a nice sunny roof, put them on and sell it back to the grid, God bless you. That's the American way. Go for it. So, something like that.
Congressman, got a question. One of the big issues here in Arkansas the last several months has been natural gas fracking, and concerns about your issue of safe water, damage to roads, all sorts of things. What do you see that? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I'll tell you what the issue we're having in Pennsylvania with that, and it's been fired up by movies, pseudo-documentaries like Gasland, which have depictions of people's faucets spewing flames, and a lot of bad rumors. And I know when the gentleman made that film, being told some other facts that were not included in there, and other follow-ups to that video as well, and that's a serious problem. Look, if someone's damaging the environment, and I've said this to the natural gas industry, anybody who does something intentionally, dumping, fracking water in a stream, breaking the law, I'm all for the death penalty for those companies saying, you can't drill. Your license are pulled. You're not drilling. Get out of here. You disrespect our laws. You disrespect our land. You're gone. But that being the case, a lot of misinformation has to do with how these are done. Now, I know the depths of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania may run 8, 9, 10,000 feet deep with multiple layers of rock. And the fracking fluid, which has been changed quite a bit, so now some companies use like 3 or 4 different chemicals in them. It's not a long list anymore. The concern is, are those things damaging? And they are ingredients we may see themselves either in some foods or in dishwashing detergents, et cetera. And the idea being to make it so that you wouldn't have bacterial growth, or you would handle some other things that would improve the fracking. But the idea is that, the point is that natural gas getting into water just doesn't make sense scientifically. When you have wells, first of all, that most families don't even use well water. Secondly, that it's between 0 and a few hundred feet deep, and fracking is several thousand feet deep, and it has to be encased by law in steel pipes and concrete. That mixture does not happen unless someone does it wrong. If they do it wrong, that's the problem, and that's why you have regulators out there. On the federal level, when we have had Lisa Jackson, the head of the EPA, before us, she has commented how she wants to come in and do some other action in Pennsylvania dealing with our water. Now, in Pennsylvania, we have 75, 80 different inspectors from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. For a multi-state region of Pennsylvania and some other states, they only have 3 or 4. If we were to wait for the EPA, we wouldn't be doing fracking. We would not have the multi-billion-dollar impact upon our economy and billions in other revenue for our state, too. So I said to her during this, she was referring also to a New York Times article, and I said, you know, that article quoted extensively the former head of DEP in Pennsylvania. She says, I know. I said, are you aware that the author of that article never talked to the head of DEP, but took old quotes of his from years past when he talked about the needs to regulate in some of the problems? And so none of that was relevant. I guess it's like any other thing. If you take something that's 10 years old and use those quotes as if it's applying to now, it's false information. And I'd asked her to pay more attention to the science of this. And we also went on with our conversation and said, do you think Pennsylvania's laws are inadequate, and if so, which ones? And if you think we inadequately enforce them, let me know which ones, and we will take action on that. Well, she didn't have information there, but it does come down to that. I mean, each state has to have a responsible and highly qualified workforce that deals with fracking and making sure the laws are strictly followed. No loopholes, no exclusions, nothing. That's it. You must follow these laws strictly. And when that's the case, I think we have this respect that can build up based upon scientific information. Plus, we're talking about dealing with fracking over a million some wells over time, and you haven't had these problems. And the problems that are out there, you can usually list them on 1 or 2 hands, and they're industrial site accidents and other problems that occur. That being said, I go back to this point when I have visited some of these places where people thought there were some problems. One, we had a fire that came with storing some residual fluids that came out of a well. Well, it had to do with the heating system that was set above the water level instead of below the water level when evaporation took place. And so as the water was evaporating, some combustive elements are there, and it caused a fire and injured cement. That's an industrial site problem. They've corrected that. It shouldn't have happened. But on other areas of the fracking, when it comes to the water contamination, my point is we shouldn't tolerate it. And when we don't, it is not a problem. And I want to make sure we continue a very high standard with that.
You have a question right over here.
Michelle Teague, I'm an architect in the city of Little Rock. My question is, within your proposal, what's the allocation to beef up state regulatory bodies? I think we have a better trust of our state departments of environmental quality, and nobody wants to see monster federal agencies. We should reserve those resources for overseeing coastal waters and things of that sort. But you mentioned several percent going to one thing and another, but what are the provisions for occupational health, safety, and welfare and the state departments of environmental quality so that we can be proud of the way that Americans are handling this development and less scared of just taking off the reins for energy development in our country?
Well, what we do in this bill is we allocate about 30% of the revenues for the host states. So any of the states that have offshore drilling, they get 30%, which more than covers. I mean, that's a big chunk of change for that. There's also a number of things in here to get the various departments in Washington, D.C. to expedite things and not take years and years and years, but work more with it. So if someone is going to be building a coal plant instead of letting, or clean up a coal plant, instead of letting permits and analysis sit on a shelf somewhere for years, move forward, work with the plant, saying, if we think this is such a big concern, let's clean it up and get to it quickly, not wait, let it sit around. The same with nuclear power. If it takes 10 years or so to permit some of these nuclear power plants, that's not always necessary to have that. Now, we have a new move forward, something called modular nuclear reactors as well. Reactors that don't cover like a square mile of space needed for that, but basically reactors like you use on aircraft carriers that could power a city or certainly communities or industrial zones too, and to work towards what would be the permitting for those as well. The idea is to set this up, that the funding is there for the states and pushes within the various departments of energy and EPA, et cetera, to get them to move cooperatively and quickly towards cleaning things up. So there are things in there. I appreciate you pointing that out. Okay.
Tim,
Where are we?
yeah, right here. Tim, if you had the ability to pass into law your ideal method for financing campaigns, what would it look like?
Well, the ideal method to finance campaigns is my opponent gets nothing. I mean, we have, this is such, and Vic knows this is such a frustrating system when you're campaigning and raising money all the time, calling up people. As I tell people I have a couple of full-time jobs. when you're in the Navy Reserve, it's a full-time job. I don't care the weekend, a month, but every day I'm doing something. Full-time job as a congressman, trying to be a full-time family man, and then full-time fundraiser is what you are too. And on the phone all the time doing that. I get worried sometimes of an area that's grown a lot, and that's the 527s. And these are the independent organizations that can put any ad they want on TV and say anything they want. I actually think that we would go a lot better if there was some requirement, if they had to pass some sort of truth test on that. And because right now you have organizations that can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on campaigns nationwide and say they want with massive attacks. I get worried about that kind of funds. I recognize it's free speech. I recognize people have a right to say that. But it has really developed into pockets of special organizations. And I mean on all sides, all spectrums here, that will go after members and say, this person is not dancing to our tune, so we will take him out or her out and find someone else. And it's really developed that level where the local citizens are having their impact diluted massively because of outside organizations coming through. That's one area I would say needs to be reformed, because it is one where when people watch ads on TV and they get things in the mail, and even if it says in the tiny print, there's always some great organizational name paid for by American citizens for freedom, democracy, apple pie, and hot dogs and Chevrolet or something like that. Well, I'll take the Chevrolet out because we wouldn't have a corporate. But then people think, oh, okay, I guess this is right. And without really knowing or understanding who's funded this, what they've done, what their interests are, I'm trying to be realistic, not cynical, but usually in a situation like that, I mean, I recognize there's a lot of good Americans trying to do the right thing, and that's fine, but there's also some people who are into these things as a way of taking care of mere narrow interests or their own profits, and profits are okay, making money is okay, but controlling Congress to do that is not okay. And so I would like more exposure and transparency of those things as well. That would be a huge change in this as well.
You had talked about the burning of coal as being a necessity, and if we don't burn it, there is a school of thought that it will be shipped out and they will burn it in China, and when they burn it in China there will be no SOx, no NOx control at all, no scrubbing at all, and they'll probably have less than supercritical units over there, so it'll be more wastefully burned. Is there any development in carbon management of the carbon cycle beyond just the sequestration, maybe using flue gases to grow algae that could be used to gin biodiesels and food for aquaculture, and some of the more advanced sciences around what to do with flue gases and how to claim them as an asset and not let them go into the environment as pollution?
Those are exciting ideas, and you're right, it isn't just a school of thought, it is happening in China, where there's a lot of coal in Pennsylvania and in the Appalachian region and around this country that's being shipped off to China. One of the reasons coal prices are so high, despite coal plants declining, is China and India are buying a lot of our coal, and metallurgical coal and other coal, burning it there with any emissions control, SOx, NOx, nothing. It's not happening. On the one hand, the ideas of moving forward, such as algae and other methods, there's a lot of advanced science of what else can be done to clean up the air. But what we have to do is, if we tell a plant it's this way or no way, our way or the highway, then the working towards that is so incredibly expensive that a lot of places just aren't going to do it. Now, I believe in our national energy technology laboratories in this country as being a centers for coordinating the research on that, but also having incentives for power plants to use some other methods, modern methods, to clean things up, and not just say it's all or none. But I might say this too. I was talking to a company that makes a special type of steel, stainless steel, used in the collector systems in coal plants. And in China, they had asked for a much weaker grade of metal in this plant. And these manufacturers, we can't figure out how would you use this, because what would happen with corrosion, it just wouldn't last very long. You need something thicker and of a different mixture, chemical mixture, to make it last much longer and stronger. Well, they found out how they could use this, less than adequate grade. They only turned it on when the inspectors were there. And so it wasn't being used. And so it's like, you know, I can have a car that can last me 20 years if I only start it up once a month. And that's where they are with that too. It's just wrong. But those emissions do come over here. And again, a discussion we've had, the EPA has said, Administrator Jackson said, they will not take into account impact upon the economy or jobs from regulations they have. Right now they're measuring things in terms of deaths caused by emissions, which is itself a big extrapolation. And you look at some of their maps, and I said, this doesn't make sense. And look at my district. It really relates more to income levels, smoking rates, health rates, obesity rates, not just emissions. And I also know where they have these emissions sniffers and collectors out. For example, in Pennsylvania, where they'll say southwestern Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area, one of the dirtiest areas in the country. One detector there next to a coke plant, that burns coal to make steel coke. You're kidding me. You're kidding me. That's the fact. That's wrong. And that's part of where we don't have real science with this. But recognizing that if we want to reduce mercury and other things, then why are we making it tough for American companies to clean it up, and instead it goes to China? It goes in the air and it comes back down here anyways. Is it global warming or is it regional? Is it global pollution or is it regional? And you can't say, well, just let it happen in China and it stays there. It does not. And it is incredible that we have this blind-sided ignorance that out of sight, out of mind. It's not. It's there. And so just to say we've lost these jobs is phenomenal. Let me add one other element, because when we had this hearing recently, Administrator Jackson also said, she agreed with one congresswoman who said, isn't it true that since the Clean Air Act, America's GDP has grown by 200%? And she says, yes. And she says, we've had a lot of jobs, some growth from people who are working on emissions, and many of those jobs, we've actually exported our technology overseas to clean it up. And I said, wait a minute, are you saying that there was a cause and effect relationship between the Clean Air Act and the GDP? Where does this science come from? This is a correlation. But I would suspect that if we instead told power plants we want to work with you incrementally towards cleaning up and making sure we're also paying attention to economic impact and jobs, that we could have gone much, much farther. And I like to remind people that one of the greatest threats to the environment is poverty. Because when you are poor, and some of you may have been there, done that. I know I grew up in a family that didn't have anything. When you are poor, you are sometimes desperate. And you don't really pay attention to these environmental issues too, because you're thinking, how do I feed my kids? How do I put shoes on their feet? How do I keep a roof in my house? That's what you're concerned about. So there's there too.
Let's thank the Congressman for being here this morning.
That's it.
I know there may be some additional questions, so maybe he'll stay around for just a minute and catch up on the questions. Congressman Snyder, always good to have you. Thank you for all you've done and continue to do.
And let me just say a thank you to you and everybody else here for this. I want to conclude with a little story, if I could, if you give me 1 minute. Look, we're in a time in this country where we're worried about our future, and we should be. And we're worried if we can, but we shouldn't be. And the reason I say that is some of you, at least as old as me, maybe some younger, but we can all remember a time when America believed in itself every day. And I want to tell you a quick story about a soldier. This is someone who I'm going to change the story around so the person remains unidentifiable, but a soldier who himself took a blast injury and affected his left side of his head, which affects some personality in the frontal lobe and some speech and understanding in the temporal lobe and some across the parietal lobe motor movement. So he had trouble moving his right arm and right leg. And one of the things that I have to sit down sometimes and talk with people about is talk with their spouses and describe the outcome of what's going to happen to one of those soldiers who have had a traumatic brain injury. And sadly, in some cases, the girlfriend or someone else leaves. They say, I can't take this, I can't be around this person. And in very tragic cases, they have power of attorney, they clean out the bank account, they go. So when we're describing these things with families, it's oftentimes a very tense moment because we also know they're in a lot of pain. And as I sat down with her and I talked about these issues, in a pensive and tearful moment, she said, you know, I sent a handsome young soldier to war, and I don't know who this man is that came back with his name. And we talked a little bit more about the outcome, the expectations, and the struggles he would have with shaving, with bathroom, with hygiene, with feeding himself, with walking, and it was going to be a long-term struggle. She knew this. Very, very difficult. And I asked her what she wanted to do. And she paused, and again with a tear in her eye, but with a lot of conviction, she said, you know, I actually made that choice on my wedding day. She said, if it takes me 50 years, I'm going to teach him to laugh and to love again. There's people out there like that. who believe in this country, who believe in our soldiers, who believe in this courage and strength. That's real courage under fire. If someone like her can make a commitment like that, all of us can make a commitment to our country to make it great again. I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I wish you all the best. Thanks.